The Queenie dynasty manufactured the toxins that defined the 20th century. They bottled saccharin, synthesized PCBs, and unleashed Agent Orange. They turned the living jungles of Vietnam into scorched earth and the creeks of Alabama into chemical sewers. John Francis Queenie started the hustle. His son Edgar scaled it into a global catastrophe. They sold products that drove farmers to suicide and saturated the food chain with carcinogens. There was no escape from what they created. Edgar Queenie died of lung cancer, consumed by the very same industrial plague he helped spread. The family is gone, but the poison they synthesized remains in the soil and in our blood forever. The failed salesman who started it all. Before it was a global monster, Monsanto was just the last-ditch effort of an embittered failure named John Francis Queenie. Queenie wasn't a scientist. He was a street-hardened salesman with a sixth-grade education and a chip on his shoulder. He had spent 30 years losing in the drug trade, and by 1901, he was tired of being poor. Living in the industrial grime of St. Louis, he decided to risk everything he had, $1,500, on a product that walked the fine line between innovation and deception: saccharin. Saccharin was the original fake food. Derived from coal tar, it was hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, but offered zero nutritional value. To the government regulators of the era, specifically the crusading chemists of the USDA, it was a poison, a deceptive chemical trick being played on the American consumer. But to John Francis Queenie, it was gold. He knew that the Coca-Cola Company and the canned food giants were desperate for a cheap alternative to sugar. He founded his company in a drafty warehouse on the banks of the Mississippi River. Because his own reputation was tattered by previous bankruptcies, he did not put his name on the door. Instead, he borrowed the maiden name of his wife, Olga Mendez Monsanto, a woman of Sephardic Jewish nobility whose family had once financed the Spanish Empire. He called the company Monsanto Chemical Works. From the very first day, the company's business model was defined by a willingness to sell what others would not. While other chemical firms focused on fertilizers or dyes, Queenie focused on the substances that entered the human body. He sold saccharin to Coca-Cola. He sold caffeine extracted from tea waste. He sold vanillin made from wood pulp. He was building an empire on the synthesis of nature, creating cheap chemical facsimiles of reality. But the true architect of the Monsanto curse, the man who would transform a local chemical shop into a global merchant of death, was not John, but his son, Edgar Monsanto Queenie. Edgar, born in 1897, was a different species of predator. While his father was a rough-and-tumble street fighter, Edgar was a cold, intellectual aristocrat. He attended Cornell University. He wrote books on corporate philosophy. He viewed business not just as a way to make money, but as a form of social Darwinism. To Edgar, the weak existed to feed the strong, and nature existed to be conquered by chemistry. In 1928, John Francis Queenie handed the presidency to Edgar. 5 years later, in 1933, the founder died. The official cause was cancer. There was a grim poetic justice in his death. The man who had launched a chemical empire died as his own cells mutated and consumed him. It was the first death in the family, a biological foreshadowing of the millions of cancer deaths that would eventually be linked to the products his company manufactured. With his father dead, Edgar Queenie was unleashed. He was not interested in sugar substitutes. He wanted to own the building blocks of modern industry. He wanted chemicals that were indestructible, ubiquitous, and massively profitable. In 1935, Edgar made the acquisition that would seal the company's fate and doom, a small town in Alabama, to a slow, agonizing death. He purchased the Swan Chemical Company located in Anniston, Alabama. Swan held the patent on a new class of miracle chemicals called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. PCBs were an industrialist's dream. They were oily, heat-resistant fluids that could be used to insulate electrical transformers, lubricate machinery, and waterproof plastics. They did not burn, they did not break down, they were forever chemicals. But they were also a biological nightmare. Almost immediately after taking over the Anniston plant, Edgar Queeny and his executives began to receive reports from the factory floor that looked like scenes from a horror movie. The workers in the PCB plant were developing a terrifying condition. Their skin was erupting in black pus-filled boils, a condition known as chlorachin. It looked like leprosy. Men were vomiting blood. They were suffering from debilitating liver pain. Their libido vanished. They walked like ghosts, their bodies ravaged by the toxic oil they handled every day. In 1937, just 2 years after buying the plant, Monsanto hired a Harvard researcher named Dr. Cecil Drinker to investigate the factory conditions. Dr. Drinker's report was confidential, blunt, and terrifying. He exposed rats to the PCB fumes. The rats died. Their livers had turned into mush. Drinker warned Edgar Queeny directly. These chemicals were systemic poisons. They attacked the liver and the skin. They were killing the workers. This was the moment of decision. A moral leader would have shut down the plant or at least invested millions in safety equipment. Edgar Queeny did neither. He looked at the profit margins. PCBs were becoming essential for the electrical grid and the U.S. military, and he made a cold calculation. The workers were expendable. The profit was essential. Internal memos from this period reveal a chilling corporate sociopathy. The executives discussed the toxicity not as a human tragedy, but as a legal liability to be managed. They decided to keep the results secret. They told the workers that the black boils were just a hygiene issue, a result of being dirty. They did not warn the town of Anniston. Instead, they ramped up production. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the Anniston plant became a factory of death. But the poison didn't stay inside the gates. To save money on waste disposal, Monsanto managers ordered the toxic sludge, thousands of tons of PCB-laced waste, to be dumped directly into the local creeks and open pits. Snow Creek, which ran through the poor African-American neighborhoods of Anniston, turned different colors, red, purple, white, depending on what the factory was dumping that day. The fish died by the thousands, floating belly up. The local children played in the creek, swimming in the rainbow water. They brought the poison home on their skin and in their clothes. Edgar Queeny knew this was happening. He visited the plant. He saw the smoke. He saw the chlorachin on the faces of his employees. But he viewed Anniston not as a community, but as a colony, a place to extract value and leave behind waste. He was busy transforming Monsanto into a defense contractor. World War II had begun, and the U.S. government needed chemicals. They needed explosives, synthetic rubber, and plastics. Monsanto became a key partner in the arsenal of democracy. Edgar Queeny spent the war years in St. Louis expanding his empire, protected by government contracts and the veil of wartime secrecy. By 1945, Monsanto was no longer just a chemical company. It was a titan. It had helped build the atomic bomb, operating the Dayton Project. It was producing DDT, the pesticide that would silence the birds, and it was pumping millions of pounds of PCBs into the American ecosystem. The sweetener era was over. The smoke era had begun. But the violence of the chemical industry was mostly slow, a quiet accumulation of toxins in the blood and bone. It took years to kill. However, in 1947, the violence became sudden, explosive, and apocalyptic. The company that had been slowly poisoning Alabama was about to be involved in the single deadliest industrial accident in American history. The Queenie Curse was moving from the creek beds of the South to the ports of Texas, and it was bringing fire with it. On the morning of April 16, 1947, the Queenie Curse manifested in the port of Texas City, Texas, not as a slow poisoning, but as a sudden apocalyptic detonation. The Monsanto Chemical Company operated a massive styrene plant on the waterfront, a sprawling complex of pipes and distillation towers that was the crown jewel of Edgar Queenie's wartime expansion. Docked right next to the Monsanto facility was a French freighter, the SS Grand Camp. The ship was being loaded with ammonium nitrate fertilizer, a volatile compound that was essentially high-grade explosive packed in paper sacks. At 9:12 a.m., a small fire in the Grand Camp's hold ignited the cargo. The resulting explosion was not merely a maritime accident. It was the equivalent of a small tactical nuclear weapon. The blast disintegrated the ship, sending a mushroom cloud 2,000 feet into the Texas sky. It knocked 2 small airplanes out of the air. The shock wave was felt 100 miles away. But the primary victim of this kinetic fury was the Monsanto plant. The factory was located less than 300 feet from the ship. The blast wave hit the chemical complex with the force of a tidal wave of steel and fire. It flattened the buildings instantly, but the horror was compounded by the chemistry. The plant was filled with tanks of styrene, a highly flammable liquid used to make plastics. The explosion ruptured these tanks, turning the wreckage into a blazing inferno. The scene inside the plant was a vision of hell. Of the 451 Monsanto employees on duty that morning, 145 were killed instantly. Many were vaporized, leaving behind nothing but shadows on the concrete. Others were crushed by falling steel or incinerated by the burning styrene. The rain of fire, molten shrapnel from the ship, fell for minutes, igniting the clothes of the survivors who were crawling through the rubble. The Texas City disaster remains the deadliest industrial accident in American history. The official death toll was 581, though many bodies were never found. Over 5,000 people were injured. The port was obliterated. Edgar Monsanto Queenie, sitting in his office in St. Louis, received the news by telegram. His reaction to the massacre of his workforce defines the cold, pragmatic sociopathy of the dynasty. He did not collapse in grief. He did not question the safety of placing a volatile chemical plant next to a munitions dock. He viewed the disaster as a logistical problem to be solved. He flew his private plane to Texas the next day. He walked through the smoking ruins, stepping over the debris of his factory and the remains of his workers. Photographs from the scene show him looking grim, determined, and utterly detached. He famously declared that the plant would be rebuilt. He did not see a graveyard. He saw a depreciated asset that needed to be brought back online. Under Queenie's orders, the reconstruction began before the fires were even fully extinguished. He pushed the survivors and the new hires to work at a breakneck pace. Within a year, the Monsanto plant in Texas City was operating again, churning out styrene for the post-war plastics boom. The 145 dead workers were memorialized with a plaque, but their true monument was the profit margin of the new facility. Edgar Queenie had proven that the company could survive the apocalypse, provided it had enough insurance money and a leader willing to step over the bodies to get to the bank. The 1950s, under Edgar's iron rule, became the decade of better living through chemistry. Having survived the physical destruction of Texas City, Queenie aggressively pivoted the company toward a new, even more lucrative market, agriculture. He realized that the chemical warfare agents developed during World War II, specifically defoliants designed to destroy enemy crops, could be repurposed for the American farm. If a chemical could kill a jungle in the Pacific, it could kill weeds in Iowa. Monsanto began to mass produce 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, powerful herbicides that were marketed to farmers as miraculous labor savers. These chemicals were effective, but they carried a hidden contaminant, a molecular stowaway created during the manufacturing process, dioxin. Dioxin is one of the most toxic substances known to science. It is a mutagen, a carcinogen, and a teratogen, causing birth defects. Even in microscopic amounts, it attacks the human genetic code. Internal memos from the 1950s suggest that Monsanto scientists were aware of the impurities in their herbicides. They knew that workers in the herbicide plants were getting sick, suffering from the same chloracin and liver damage seen in the PCB plants. But Edgar Queeney's directive was growth. The American suburbs were exploding. People wanted weed-free lawns. Farmers wanted higher yields. Monsanto gave them the chemicals to achieve it, packaging the poison in friendly cans with bright logos. As the decade drew to a close, Edgar Queeney began to step back from the day-to-day operations, handing the reins to professional managers, though he remained the chairman and the spiritual godfather of the company. He spent his final years writing books on wildlife and filming documentaries in Africa, cultivating the image of a conservationist. It was the ultimate deception. The man who claimed to love nature had built an empire dedicated to poisoning it. By 1959, the Queeney dynasty had successfully transformed Monsanto from a sweetener merchant into a global chemical leviathan. They had survived the Great Depression, profited from World War II, and rebuilt from the ashes of Texas City. But they had planted the seeds of their own moral destruction. The PCB waste was still leaking into the water in Anniston. The dioxin was accumulating in the soil of American farms. And in the laboratories of the company, scientists were already mixing the batch for their next great project, a military contract for the U.S. Air Force that would turn the jungles of Vietnam into a toxic wasteland. The sweetener was gone. The smoke of Texas City had cleared. But while the company looked for new markets abroad, a silent, invisible poison was already seeping into the soil of the American South. The town that was poisoned for profit. By 1960, the small industrial town of Anniston, Alabama, had acquired a nickname that would eventually sound like a cruel joke: the Model City. Nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, it was a segregated working-class community divided by race and united by the heavy chemical fog that hung over its western neighborhoods. To the white residents on the east side, Anniston was a picture of southern prosperity. But to the African-American residents of West Anniston, it was a death trap. They lived in the shadow of the Monsanto chemical plant, a sprawling complex of smokestacks and pipes that operated 24 hours a day, churning out the miracle chemical that lubricated the American electrical grid, PCBS. The relationship between the factory and the neighborhood was intimate and lethal. The plant did not just exist next to the homes, it bled into them. The primary artery of this poisoning was a small meandering stream called Snow Creek. It flowed directly out of the Monsanto facility, winding through the backyards of the black community, past the porches where families sat in the evening, and directly alongside the playgrounds where children played. In the early 1960s, Snow Creek ceased to be a body of water and became an open sewer for industrial waste. Monsanto managers, driven by the relentless production quotas demanded by St. Louis, ordered the dumping of thousands of pounds of PCB-laden sludge directly into the water. They treated the creek not as a protected ecosystem, but as a free disposal chute. The result was a scene of apocalyptic pollution that defied belief. Residents recall that the creek would change color daily depending on what batch the factory was running. On Mondays, it might be a deep, bruised purple. On Tuesdays, a milky, toxic white. On Fridays, a blood red. The water didn't just flow, it steamed. In the winter, the chemical reaction was so intense that the creek never froze, emitting a warm, sickly sweet vapor that coated the windows of the nearby houses in a greasy film. For the children of West Anniston, Snow Creek was their swimming pool. They jumped into the rainbow water, fascinated by the iridescent oil slicks that shimmered on the surface. They caught the fish, bream and bass, that were bloated and covered in sores, and they brought them home for dinner. They molded the clay from the banks into toys, unaware that the mud was saturated with one of the most potent carcinogens known to science. The biological consequences were immediate and horrifying. Children would emerge from the water with their skin peeling off in sheets. They developed chlorachin, a disfiguring condition where the skin erupts in black, pus-filled cysts that cover the face and back. It looked like a plague. Mothers took their children to local doctors, but in a company town, the diagnosis was always the same: poor hygiene. The victims were gaslighted. They were told they were dirty when in reality they were being poisoned. Inside the plant, the conditions were a mirror image of the horror outside. Workers, many of whom lived in the neighborhood they were polluting, waded through ankle-deep pools of PCB oil, brand name Aerochlor. They inhaled the fumes without respirators. They ate their lunches with chemical-coated hands. They began to drop dead of mysterious ailments, liver failure, heart attacks at age 40, and aggressive cancers that consumed them in weeks. Monsanto knew exactly what was happening. The company's internal files from this period, 1960 to 1965, reveal a terrifying awareness of the toxicity. They knew that PCBS bioaccumulated in the fat cells of living creatures. They knew it caused liver damage in rats. But PCBS were the liquid gold of the electrical industry. They were fire-resistant coolants used in every transformer and capacitor in America. To stop production would be to shut down the power grid and cut off the company's most reliable revenue stream. So, they kept dumping. The cynicism reached a peak in 1965. The waste pits on the factory grounds were full. The creek was choked with sludge. To solve the storage problem, Monsanto managers authorized the purchase of a nearby landfill to dump the excess waste. But they didn't line the pits. They didn't seal the drums. They simply poured millions of pounds of PCB residue into the earth, knowing full well that the groundwater would carry it directly into the wells of the local farmers and residents. One resident, David Baker, who grew up in West Anniston during this era, later described the community as a slow-motion graveyard. He watched his neighbors die one by one. He saw his brother die of a lung disease at age 16. He saw women suffering multiple miscarriages. The town was being depopulated by a silent killer. But the horror of Anniston was local. The world didn't know. To the regulators in Washington and the consumers in New York, Monsanto was still the benevolent creator of plastics and pesticides. The screams of West Anniston were muffled by segregation and poverty. It was the perfect crime, a massacre conducted in a sacrifice zone where the victims were too poor and too marginalized to be heard. However, nature has a way of revealing what men try to hide. The poison could not be contained in West Anniston forever. By the mid-1960s, the PCBs were migrating. They traveled down Snow Creek into Chocolaco Creek, and from there into the Coosa River. The fish were dying miles downstream. The birds that ate the fish were dropping from the sky. The environment itself was beginning to testify against the company. As 1965 turned into 1966, the secret was about to be breached. A series of biological anomalies, fish kills so massive they clogged the intake pipes of power plants, would force Monsanto scientists to conduct their own internal investigation. What they found in their own labs would terrify them, not because of the moral implication, but because of the financial liability. They were about to discover that their product killed fish in 10 seconds, a finding that would trigger one of the most aggressive cover-ups in corporate history. By 1966, the biological evidence of the disaster in Anniston had become too large to ignore, even for a company practiced in the art of blindness. The fish kills in Chocolaco Creek were no longer sporadic, they were systematic. Local fishermen reported pulling up base with their skin eaten away, their eyes bulging, and their internal organs liquefied. The stench of death hung over the water. To determine the precise lethality of their own effluent, Monsanto's scientists decided to conduct a secret field experiment that would yield one of the most chilling data points in the history of environmental science. In November 1966, a team of company researchers arrived at the banks of Snow Creek. They brought with them a cage filled with 25 healthy bluegill sunfish. The plan was simple: lower the cage into the water downstream from the plant's discharge pipe and time how long it took for the fish to show signs of distress. They expected the fish to sicken over the course of a day, perhaps a week. They lowered the cage. In 3.5 minutes, all 25 fish were dead. The scientists were stunned. They repeated the test. They diluted the creek water with clean water to see if the toxicity could be managed. Even at diluted concentrations, the fish convulsed, shed their scales, and died within minutes. The water flowing through the backyards of West Anniston was not just polluted. It was an immediate, acute chemical weapon. It killed biological life on contact. The internal report filed by the lead scientist, Dr. D.R. Kelly, was unequivocal. He wrote that the creek water was toxic to fish in 10 seconds. He warned that the concentration of PCBs was so high that we might lose our business. But he was not referring to the loss of human life. He was referring to the risk of being shut down by the state. The 10-second memo should have been a fire alarm. Instead, it was treated as a state secret. The report was stamped confidential, read and destroy. It never left the executive suite. The company did not warn the fishermen. They did not put up signs warning children not to swim. They did not stop the dumping. They reasoned that fish were not people, and as long as the people weren't dropping dead in 3 minutes, the business could continue. But the poison refused to stay local. In 1967, a massive ecological mystery began to unfold hundreds of miles away in the Mississippi River. Biologists in St. Louis and New Orleans began to notice a disturbing phenomenon. Millions of fish were dying in the Mississippi Delta. Birds that fed on the fish, eagles, ospreys, pelicans, were vanishing. Their eggshells were thinning, cracking before the chicks could hatch. It was an ecological collapse reminiscent of the DDT crisis, but the chemical culprit was unknown. A Swedish researcher named Soren Jensen finally cracked the code. He analyzed the tissue of the dead birds and found high concentrations of a chemical that looked like DDT but wasn't. It was polychlorinated biphenyls, Monsanto's PCBs. The realization hit the Monsanto headquarters like a bomb. Their product wasn't just killing creeks in Alabama. It was poisoning the global food chain. PCBs were traveling through the water, evaporating into the air, and accumulating in the fat of polar bears in the Arctic and breast milk in Europe. The Aniston problem had become a planetary crisis. Faced with the potential for global liability, the executives in St. Louis formed a secret war council. In late 1967, they established the Ad Hoc Committee on Aerochlor. Aerochlor was the trade name for their PCBs. The minutes of this committee, which would remain hidden for 30 years, are a masterclass in corporate cynicism. The executives did not discuss how to clean up the environment. They discussed how to protect the gross profit. In a memo dated October 2, 1967, the committee laid out its objectives. The first goal was to permit continued sales and profits of Aerochlor. The second goal was to protect the image of the corporation. The health of the public was not listed as a goal. The committee debated the options. They knew the chemicals were uncontrollable. They knew they were accumulating in the environment. One executive asked, "Should we tell our customers?" The answer was a resounding no. They decided to adopt a strategy of sell and deny. They would continue to sell PCBs to their biggest customers, General Electric and Westinghouse, while quietly altering the chemical formula to make it slightly less persistent. A cosmetic change that did nothing to reduce the immediate toxicity. They would deny that PCBs were the cause of the fish kills. They would attack the scientists who found the chemical in the wild, labeling their testing methods as flawed. But the most damning decision concerned the conscience of the company. In a handwritten note on the margins of a committee agenda, one executive summed up the entire philosophy of the Queenie dynasty. We cannot afford to lose $1 of business. This was the moral event horizon. They had the 10-second fish data. They had the bird extinction data. They had the reports of chloracin from the factory floor. And they looked at all of it and decided that the dollar was worth more than the life. As 1967 ended, Monsanto ramped up production at the Aniston plant to record levels. They were racing to sell as much of the poison as possible before the regulators caught up. The factory ran 24 hours a day, spewing black smoke into the sky and dumping red sludge into Snow Creek. The children of West Aniston continued to swim in the rainbow water, unaware that the men in St. Louis had already priced their lives and found them cheap. The ad hoc committee had done its job. They had bought the company a few more years of profit, but they had also ensured that when the truth finally came out, it would not be a regulatory fine. It would be a crime against humanity. The era of scientific doubt was over. The era of the cover-up had begun. And the man who would preside over this final betrayal was Edgar Queenie himself, now dying of lung cancer, coughing his life away, while his legacy poisoned the world. On July 7, 1968, the Queenie curse finally claimed its architect. Edgar Monsanto Queenie, the ruthless scion who had transformed a small chemical shop into a global titan, died in a hospital in St. Louis. The cause of death was lung cancer. The irony was absolute. The man who had spent his life synthesizing chemicals that attacked the respiratory systems of his workers and the immune systems of his neighbors spent his final months gasping for breath, his own lungs consumed by malignant cells. He died leaving behind a personal fortune, a charitable foundation, and a company that was secretly poisoning the planet. But his death did not stop the machine. It merely removed the last vestige of family accountability. The corporation was now run by technocrats, men who viewed the Aniston problem not as a moral crisis, but as a spreadsheet error to be corrected. In the wake of Edgar's death, the ad hoc committee in St. Louis accelerated its work. By 1969, the pressure was mounting. The environmental movement was waking up. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had alerted the public to the dangers of pesticides, and regulators were beginning to ask questions about mystery chemicals found in dead eagles and milk supplies. Monsanto faced a binary choice. They could admit that PCBs were uncontrollable toxins, stop production, and begin the massive, expensive work of cleaning up Anniston. Or they could lie. In early 1969, the committee circulated a confidential document that stands as one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the history of corporate jurisprudence. It was a strategy memo titled Pollution Letter. In cold bureaucratic language, the memo outlined the company's priorities. It listed 3 options. Option 1, go out of the PCB business entirely, rejected as unacceptable due to lost profit. Option 2, sell only to closed systems where leaks were unlikely, considered too restrictive. Option 3, sell the hell out of them as long as we can. The committee chose option 3. They explicitly listed their goals for the year 1969. Goal number 1 was permit continued sales and profits. Goal number 2 was protect the image of the corporation. Nowhere on the list was protect human health or save the residents of Anniston. They had quantified the value of a human life against the value of a barrel of Aerochlor, and they had decided the barrel was worth more. To execute this strategy of maximum profit before the ban, Monsanto engaged in a campaign of deception that targeted its own customers. They knew that giants like General Electric and Westinghouse used millions of pounds of PCBs in their transformers. If these companies panicked, the market would collapse. So, Monsanto lied to them. They sent letters to GE assuring them that the reports of PCB toxicity were exaggerated. They claimed that their new reformulated PCBs were biodegradable, a scientific impossibility. They urged their customers to ignore the hysteria of the environmentalists. Simultaneously, they hardened their hearts against the people of Anniston. By 1969, the situation in West Anniston was critical. The hogs raised by local farmers were dying in their pens, their livers black and necrotic. The chickens were laying eggs with soft shells. The residents were suffering from dizzy spells and rashes. Monsanto's response was to blame the victims. When a local farmer complained that his creek was turning red and his cows were sick, Monsanto sent a lawyer, not a veterinarian. They told the farmer he was grazing his cattle wrong. They bought the silence of a few vocal landowners with small cash settlements, often just a few $100s, in exchange for signing waivers that absolved the company of all future liability. They bought the land next to the creek, fenced it off, and posted no trespassing signs, effectively seizing the crime scene to prevent anyone from taking samples. But the most chilling document from 1969 was a handwritten note from a meeting of the Safety Committee. Discussing the toxicity data on fish and rats, a Monsanto executive scribbled a phrase that would later be projected onto courtroom walls as proof of malice. We can't afford to lose $1 of business. This was the ethos of the post-Queenie era. It was a scorched earth capitalism. They knew the regulations were coming. They knew the EPA, which would be formed in 1970, was coming. So they decided to pump as much poison into the system as possible, as fast as possible, to bank the profits before the window closed. As the year 1969 drew to a close, the factory in Anniston was running at breakneck speed. The smoke poured from the stacks. The sludge poured into the creek. And in St. Louis, the executives celebrated a year of record earnings. They had successfully navigated the death of their founder and the discovery of their toxicity without losing a cent of shareholder value. They believed they had contained the secret, but they had made a mistake. They assumed that the poison would disappear. They didn't understand that PCBs are immortal. Every ounce they dumped in 1969 is still there today, embedded in the mud of Snow Creek, waiting. And while they were burying the evidence in Alabama, they were already preparing for their next great venture, a government contract that would take their chemical expertise out of the electrical grid and drop it directly onto the heads of human beings in a jungle 9,000 miles away. The year 1970 marked a pivotal turning point in American history. It was the year of the first Earth Day, the year President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the year the public finally began to understand that industrial progress had a biological cost. But in St. Louis, inside the headquarters of Monsanto, 1970 was the year the cover-up went from a passive strategy of silence to an active strategy of fraud. With the creation of the EPA, the federal government finally had the power to ask questions. Monsanto knew the questions were coming. They knew the new regulators would eventually look at PCBS. To preempt this, the company engaged in a preemptive strike against the truth. They submitted a series of studies to the government that were masterpieces of scientific deception. Internal documents later revealed that Monsanto manipulated its own data. When their lab tests showed that PCBs cause liver tumors in rats, they allegedly reclassified the tumors as regenerative nodules, a benign-sounding term for a precancerous lesion. They cherry-picked the clean samples. They presented the government with a sanitized version of reality, arguing that while PCBs were persistent, they were not acutely toxic to humans. It was a lie designed to buy time, to keep the factories running for just a few more years while they developed a substitute. But while they could fool the bureaucrats in Washington with spreadsheets, they could not fool the biology of Anniston, Alabama. By 1970, the poison had saturated the food chain so thoroughly that the local ecosystem was beginning to collapse. The primary victims of this phase were the local farmers. Men who had grazed cattle along Chocolaco Creek for generations watched in horror as their herds began to waste away. The cows lost their hair. They stumbled like drunks. They gave birth to calves that were stillborn or horribly deformed. When the farmers cut open the dead animals, they found livers that were black and hard as rocks. When these farmers called Monsanto to complain, the company did not send veterinarians. They sent adjusters. These company men walked onto the farms, looked at the dying animals, and delivered a verdict that was gaslighting in its purest form. They told the farmers that they were bad husbandmen. They blamed the deaths on poor nutrition, parasites, or neglect. They shamed the victims, accusing them of incompetence to cover up the fact that the grass the cows were eating was coated in a layer of invisible poison deposited by the creek's floodwaters. In a few cases where the evidence was too overwhelming to deny, Monsanto quietly bought the cattle. But they didn't bury them. They shipped them away, destroyed the carcasses, and paid the farmers a pittance in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. They were buying the evidence of their crime, cow by cow. One farmer, however, refused to be silenced. A man named Russell Mahaffey noticed his hogs were dying after drinking from the creek. He hired independent vets. He started asking questions. Monsanto, sensing a threat, descended on him. They bought his land. They bought his silence. They effectively erased his farm from the map, turning it into a buffer zone to keep prying eyes away from the creek. As 1970 drew to a close, the town that was poisoned was effectively a colony of the corporation. Monsanto owned the land, employed the people, and controlled the narrative. The doctors in the local hospital, often dependent on Monsanto's donations, were hesitant to diagnose chemical poisoning. The local politicians were silent. The ad hoc committee in St. Louis had succeeded. They had kept the lid on the boiling pot for another year. But the executives were already looking past Aniston. They had realized that the domestic market for chemicals was becoming too regulated, too soft. They needed a client who didn't care about the EPA. They needed a customer who wanted things to die. They found that customer in the United States Air Force. While the lawyers were burying the PCB data, the chemists in the agricultural division had perfected a new mixture. It was a defoliant, a herbicide so powerful it could strip a jungle canopy in days. It was a 50-50 mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. It was shipped in steel drums marked with a color-coded stripe. The most popular mixture had an orange stripe. The Aniston cover-up had taught the company a valuable lesson. If you control the data, you control the reality. Now they were about to apply that lesson to a war zone. The sweetener company was gone. The PCB company was under siege. The era of Agent Orange had arrived, and the Queenie dynasty was about to export its toxic legacy from the creeks of Alabama to the rivers of Vietnam. Did they know they were killing their own soldiers? While the ad hoc committee in St. Louis was debating how to hide the toxicity of PCBs in Alabama, a far darker strategy was being hatched in the war rooms of Washington, D.C., and the laboratories of the United States military. The early 1960s saw the escalation of the Vietnam War, a conflict fought not on open plains but in dense, impenetrable jungle. The Viet Cong used the canopy as a shield, hiding their supply lines, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and ambushing American patrols from the safety of the foliage. The Pentagon needed a solution. They didn't want to just kill the enemy. They wanted to kill the environment itself. The solution was chemical warfare, disguised as herbicide. The U.S. Air Force launched Operation Ranch Hand, a mission with a chilling motto: "Only we can prevent forests." To execute this mission, the government turned to the masters of agricultural chemistry, Monsanto and Dow Chemical. Monsanto was contracted to produce a defoliant mixture that was brutally effective. It consisted of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, mixed in a 50-50 ratio. The chemicals were shipped in 55-gallon steel drums marked with a color-coded stripe to identify the specific mixture. There was Agent White, Agent Blue, and Agent Pink, but the most potent, the most widely used, and the most deadly mixture was marked with an orange stripe, Agent Orange. Between 1961 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Monsanto was one of the primary suppliers. Their formulation of Agent Orange was particularly potent because it contained higher levels of a specific contaminant than the versions made by other companies. That contaminant was 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or simply TCDD. TCDD is the most toxic form of dioxin. It is a persistent organic pollutant that does not break down. It enters the soil, the water, and the food chain. When humans are exposed to it, it wreaks havoc on the cellular level. It causes cancer, specifically soft tissue sarcomas and lymphomas. It attacks the nervous system, but its most horrific effect is teratogenic. It alters the development of the fetus in the womb. Monsanto knew this. Internal memos from the mid-1960s, later unearthed during veterans' lawsuits, revealed that the company's scientists were aware that the manufacturing process for 2,4,5-T created dioxin as a byproduct. They knew that dioxin was toxic. They had seen the chloracin on their own workers in the Nitro, West Virginia plant where the chemical was made. In one incident in 1949, an explosion at the Nitro plant had exposed hundreds of workers to the chemical. Years later, those workers were dying of cancer at alarming rates. Yet, when the Pentagon called, Monsanto did not warn them. They did not change the manufacturing process to reduce the dioxin levels, which would have been expensive and slowed production. They shipped the poison. They treated the war in Vietnam as a massive government-subsidized field test for their product. The spraying began in earnest in 1962. C-123 transport planes, fitted with high-pressure nozzles, flew low over the Vietnamese countryside, trailing white clouds of mist. The chemical rained down on everything: the trees, the crops, the rivers, and the people. For the Vietnamese civilians, it was a confusing, terrifying plague. The orange rain didn't burn immediately. It felt sticky, but within days the jungle turned brown and died. The leaves fell off the trees, the crops withered, the food supply was destroyed. Then the sickness started. Villagers developed skin rashes, their eyes burned, animals died. But the true horror would not be visible for months or even years, when the women who had been exposed to the spray or who had drunk the water or eaten the food contaminated by it began to give birth. The results were nightmarish. Babies were born with missing limbs, with hydrocephalus, swollen heads, with their eyes fused shut or with no eyes at all. They were born with spina bifida, their spines split open. This was the Monsanto legacy in Vietnam. It wasn't just a destroyed forest. It was a genetic mutation of the population. But the poison didn't distinguish between enemy and friend. The American soldiers on the ground, the young draftees patrolling the jungle, were also soaked in the spray. They drank from the streams. They slept in the defoliated clearings. They were told by their commanders that the chemical was safe, that it was just a weed killer, like they used on their lawns back home. They believed the lie. They watched the planes fly over and cheered, thinking it would deny the enemy cover. They didn't know that the mist falling on their skin was a slow-acting death sentence. As the war dragged on into the late 1960s, Edgar Monsanto Queenie, the architect of the company's chemical dominance, was watching from St. Louis. He was dying. The man who had authorized the production of PCBS and the expansion into herbicides was coughing his life away, his own lungs consumed by cancer. He died in 1968, just as the spraying of Agent Orange reached its peak volume. His death removed the last link to the founding family. The company was now fully in the hands of professional managers who viewed the Vietnam contract simply as a revenue stream. They ramped up production. They fought off attempts by the government to regulate the dioxin levels. By 1969, reports of birth defects in Vietnam began to leak into the Western press. Scientists began to raise the alarm. The ecocide in Vietnam was becoming a global scandal, but Monsanto held the line. They denied that their product was harmful. They hid behind the government's orders, claiming they were just a contractor fulfilling a military specification. It was a defense they would use for decades. We were just following orders. But the internal documents told a different story. They weren't just following orders, they were hiding the toxicity data that might have stopped the orders from being given. They were silent partners in a chemical assault on a civilian population. As the Vietnam War ground into the 1970s, the devastation on the ground became impossible to hide. The jungles, once lush and green, had been turned into brown skeletal wastelands. The mangrove forests of the Mekong Delta were dead, their roots rotting in the poisoned mud. But the most terrifying transformation was happening in the bodies of the people. In Vietnamese villages heavily sprayed by Operation Ranch Hand, doctors began to see a spike in horrors. Women were giving birth to monsters, babies with no brains, anencephaly, fused limbs, and severe cleft palates. The rate of spontaneous abortion skyrocketed. Cancers that were once rare, like soft tissue sarcoma, became commonplace. The American soldiers, too, were beginning to sicken. Young men in their 20s were developing rashes that wouldn't heal, chloracin. They were suffering from numbness in their hands and feet. They were coming home with a mysterious illness that the Veterans Administration VA dismissed as stress or jungle rot. But the science was catching up. In 1969, a study commissioned by the National Cancer Institute revealed that 2,4,5-T, 1/2 of Agent Orange, caused birth defects in mice. The study was initially suppressed by the White House, but it leaked. The revelation caused a panic. In April 1970, the U.S. government restricted the use of Agent Orange. The spraying missions were curtailed and eventually stopped in 1971. The remaining stocks, thousands of barrels of Monsanto's poison, were gathered up, shipped to Johnston Atoll in the Pacific, and incinerated at sea. But the legacy could not be burned away. The dioxin had already entered the soil, the water, and the DNA of a generation. In 1970, the first class action lawsuits were filed by American veterans against the chemical manufacturers. They didn't sue the government, which has sovereign immunity. They sued the contractors, Monsanto, Dow, Diamond Shamrock, and others. The veterans argued that the companies knew. They argued that Monsanto had known since the 1949 nitro plant explosion that the chemical was toxic. They argued that the company had failed to warn the government or the soldiers. They argued that Monsanto had prioritized the speed of production over the purity of the product, knowingly shipping dirty Agent Orange laden with high levels of dioxin to maximize profit. Monsanto's defense was a masterclass in legal evasion. They employed the government contractor defense. They argued that they were simply following the precise specifications of the Pentagon. They claimed the government knew about the toxicity and ordered it anyway. They positioned themselves as patriotic suppliers who had answered the call of duty. The legal battle dragged on for over a decade. It was a war of attrition. The veterans were dying of cancer, while the lawyers argued over jurisdiction and discovery. Monsanto's strategy was to delay, hoping the plaintiffs would die or run out of money before a trial could be held. But the veterans had a powerful ally: public opinion. The image of crippled soldiers, abandoned by their government and poisoned by corporate greed, was a political nightmare. In 1984, on the eve of the trial, the chemical companies blinked. They agreed to a settlement. 7 chemical companies led by Monsanto and Dow agreed to pay $180 million into a fund for the affected veterans. It was the largest settlement of its kind in history, but for the veterans, it was a betrayal. The settlement came with no admission of liability. The average payout to a totally disabled veteran was roughly $12,000, a pittance that barely covered funeral costs. The companies had bought their way out of a trial that would have exposed their internal documents to the world. They had sealed the record. And what of the Vietnamese? The settlement covered only American soldiers. The millions of Vietnamese victims, the children born with twisted limbs, the farmers dying of cancer, received $0. They filed their own lawsuit in U.S. courts years later, but it was dismissed. The U.S. courts ruled that Agent Orange was a herbicide, not a chemical weapon, and therefore its use was not a war crime. This was the Monsanto legacy. They had profited from the destruction of a country. They had poisoned their own nation's soldiers, and they had walked away with their profits intact, protected by the shield of government immunity and the power of their legal team. But while the Agent Orange scandal was concluding in the courtroom, Monsanto was already preparing its next act. The company's scientists, the same minds that had synthesized the defoliants for war, were now turning their attention back to peace. They were looking at the American farm. They had a new idea. They realized that the future of agriculture was not just in killing weeds, but in controlling the very genetics of the crops themselves. They were about to launch a product that would revolutionize farming and create a new, even more controversial monopoly. Is the weed killer in your garage deadly? By 1976, the smoke of the Texas City explosion had cleared, and the orange rain of the Vietnam War was drying on the leaves of a devastated jungle. But inside the corporate fortress of Monsanto in St. Louis, a new, quieter revolution was being planned. The executives, led by a new generation of managers who viewed the world through the lens of biochemistry rather than heavy industry, realized that the future was not in bulk chemicals. The era of selling PCBs and Agent Orange was ending, the legal liabilities were mounting, and the public was waking up. To survive, Monsanto needed to evolve from a merchant of death into a master of life. The architect of this transformation was Richard Mahoney, a driven, visionary executive who would eventually become CEO. Mahoney saw that the company's greatest asset was not its factories, but its patents. He looked at the emerging field of biotechnology, the manipulation of DNA, and saw the ultimate monopoly. If Monsanto could patent the very seeds that farmers planted, it would control the food supply of the planet. This was the birth of the genetic war. The weapon for this war had already been discovered in 1974 by Monsanto chemist John Franz. It was glyphosate, marketed as Roundup. It was a herbicide of unprecedented lethality. It killed every green thing it touched: weeds, grass, crops. For a farmer, this was both a miracle and a curse. It could clear a field in days, but it couldn't be used during the growing season because it would kill the corn and soy along with the weeds. Mahoney and his team of scientists, led by the brilliant Ernest Jaworski, asked a radical question. What if we could change the crop so it couldn't be killed? What if we could insert a gene into a soybean plant that made it immune to Roundup? The race to create the genetically modified organism, GMO, began in the late 1970s. It was a scientific sprint that rivaled the Manhattan Project in its intensity and secrecy. Inside the life sciences division, scientists were splicing genes from bacteria into petunias, trying to crack the code of resistance. They were playing God with the genome, but the real battle was not in the lab. It was in Washington, D.C. Mahoney knew that GMOs would terrify the public. The idea of frankenfoods was already circulating in science fiction. To make his vision a reality, he needed the United States government to clear the path. He needed a regulatory environment that treated these radically new organisms as if they were perfectly normal. Throughout the 1980s, Monsanto launched a massive, sophisticated lobbying campaign directed at the Reagan and Bush White Houses. They didn't just ask for approval, they rewrote the rules. Their lobbyists, many of whom were former government officials revolving through the door, successfully argued for a regulatory doctrine known as substantial equivalence. This doctrine was the legal magic trick of the century. It stated that if a GMO corn looked like corn and tasted like corn, it was corn. It did not require special testing. It did not require long-term human health studies. And most critically, it did not require labeling. In 1992, Vice President Dan Quayle announced the policy at a press conference, surrounded by Monsanto executives. The government had effectively decided that the consumer had no right to know what was in their food. The path was clear. By 1995, the science was ready. Monsanto had successfully engineered a soybean that could survive a bath of Roundup. They had also engineered corn that produced its own pesticide, Bt corn. They were ready to launch. But this launch was not just about selling seeds, it was about enslaving the farmer. Historically, farming was a cycle of independence. A farmer bought seeds once, grew his crop, and then saved the seeds from the harvest to plant the next year. It was a self-sustaining rhythm that had existed for 10,000 years. Monsanto destroyed it. To buy the new Roundup-ready seeds, farmers were forced to sign a technology stewardship agreement. It was a contract written by lawyers, not agrarians. In the fine print, it contained a clause that was revolutionary in its cruelty. Farmers were strictly forbidden from saving seeds. If they wanted to grow Monsanto soy, they had to buy new seeds every single year. They had to pay a technology fee for the privilege, and they had to agree to let Monsanto inspect their fields at any time. The farmers of America were skeptical. They saw the trap. But the promise of higher yields and easier weed control was seductive. And once a neighbor started using Roundup-ready seeds, the pressure to conform was immense. The genetic war had begun, and the first casualty was the independence of the American farmer. As 1995 drew to a close, the trucks rolled out of the St. Louis distribution centers, carrying bags of seeds that would change the face of the earth. The Queenie dynasty, long gone from the boardroom, had left behind a company that was no longer content with poisoning the water. It was now rewriting the code of life itself. The era of the seed police was about to begin. As the spring planting season of 1996 arrived, the American heartland underwent a transformation that was invisible to the naked eye, but revolutionary in its implications. Millions of acres of soybeans were planted with Monsanto's new Roundup-ready seeds. To the farmers, the initial promise was undeniably seductive. For generations, they had battled weeds with tilling machines and complex cocktails of herbicides that had to be applied with surgical precision. Now Monsanto offered a nuclear option. They could simply spray their entire fields with Roundup. The weeds would wither and die, but the genetically modified soy, engineered to resist the poison, would stand tall and green. It was the promise of perfect control over nature, but the convenience came with a hidden price tag that had nothing to do with money. It was the price of freedom. By signing the purchase contracts, farmers were unknowingly conscripting themselves into a legal regime that treated agriculture not as a husbandry of the earth, but as the licensing of intellectual property. They had agreed, in fine print they rarely read, that they no longer owned the seeds they grew. The seeds belonged to Monsanto. To enforce this new reality, the company created a private intelligence agency that would become the most hated organization in rural America, the Seed Police. Beginning in 1997, Monsanto hired teams of retired police officers and private investigators from agencies like Pinkerton. Their mission was to hunt down seed savers. In the eyes of the company, a farmer who saved seeds from his harvest to plant the next year, a practice that had sustained humanity since the dawn of agriculture, was a thief stealing proprietary technology. The tactics used by the seed police were aggressive, intrusive, and terrifying. Investigators would stake out farms from the roadside, using high-powered cameras to photograph planting equipment. They would trespass into fields in the dead of night to snip leaf samples for DNA testing. They dug through the trash of farm offices looking for receipts. But the most effective weapon was social engineering. Monsanto set up a toll-free hotline, 1-800-ROUNDUP, and encouraged farmers to inform on their neighbors. In tight-knit rural communities, where trust was the currency of survival, this introduced a toxic paranoia. If a farmer saw his neighbor saving money on seeds, he might make the call out of jealousy or spite. The company turned the American Midwest into a surveillance state. When a violation was suspected, the company did not send a warning. They sent a legal death squad. Small family farmers, men who worked 16-hour days to keep their multi-generational homesteads afloat, would suddenly receive letters demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties and legal fees. If they couldn't pay, Monsanto sued them. The company filed hundreds of lawsuits in federal courts, bankrupting farmers with legal costs before a trial could even begin. The strategy was shock and awe. They wanted to make examples of a few to terrify the many. The most famous and chilling example of this legal warfare occurred in 1998, not in the U.S., but just across the border in Saskatchewan, Canada. The victim was a 67-year-old canola farmer named Percy Schmeiser. Schmeiser was an old-school farmer. He saved his own seeds. He had never bought Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. He didn't want it. But in 1997, he found Roundup Ready plants growing in his fields. The seeds had not been planted by him. They had blown onto his land from a neighbor's truck or been carried by the wind. It was biological pollution, an invasive species trespassing on his property. Schmeiser thought he was the victim, but in August 1998, Monsanto sued him. The company argued that it didn't matter how the seeds got there. They argued that because Schmeiser's crop contained their patented gene, he was using their technology without a license. They demanded he hand over his entire harvest and pay tens of thousands in fines. It was a legal argument of breathtaking arrogance. Monsanto was claiming that if their pollution contaminated your land, they owned your land. Schmeiser refused to settle. He mortgaged his farm to pay his lawyers. He fought Monsanto all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. The battle destroyed his finances and consumed his retirement. In the end, the court ruled in a split decision that was technically a victory for Monsanto's patent rights, affirming that the gene was their property, but a moral victory for Schmeiser. He didn't have to pay the fines because he hadn't profited from the invention. But the message to farmers across North America was clear. Resistance is futile. If the wind blows the wrong way, you lose your farm. By the year 2000, the conquest of the American soy and corn markets was nearly complete. Over 70% of the soybeans in the U.S. were Roundup Ready. The seed police had effectively crushed the practice of seed saving in the commercial sector. Monsanto had achieved a biological monopoly. They controlled the seed, they controlled the chemical that the seed required, and they controlled the legal system that enforced the bond between the two. But while the farmers in Iowa were being sued into submission, a far darker tragedy was beginning to unfold on the other side of the world. The genetic war was about to move to India, where the stakes were not just bankruptcy, but life itself. The introduction of BT cotton was about to trigger a wave of death that would make the American lawsuits look like a minor dispute. The era of the suicide seeds was dawning. While the farmers of the American Midwest were battling Monsanto's lawyers in federal court, a far more visceral and deadly tragedy was unfolding in the cotton fields of India. The year 2001 marked Monsanto's aggressive entry into the Indian agricultural market, a move that was framed by the company's PR department as a humanitarian mission to modernize the developing world. They introduced a genetically modified crop called BT cotton. BT cotton was engineered to produce its own pesticide, a toxin derived from the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, which would kill the bollworm, a pest that had plagued Indian cotton farmers for generations. The sales pitch was simple. Buy our magic seeds, and you will need less pesticide, your yields will triple, and you will escape poverty. For millions of small-scale Indian farmers, this promise was irresistible. They were desperate. They lived on the edge of subsistence, farming small plots of land dependent on the monsoon rains. Monsanto's marketing machine, utilizing Bollywood actors and village roadshows, sold them a dream of prosperity. But the dream came with a trap door. The BT cotton seeds were 4 times more expensive than the traditional local varieties. To afford them, the farmers had to take out loans. In rural India, where the banking system was weak, this meant borrowing from private moneylenders, sharks, who charged usurious interest rates. The farmers bought the seeds, planted them, and waited for the miracle. In the first year, for some, the yields did increase, but the biological reality of the new crop soon revealed itself. Bt cotton was a thirsty plant. It required consistent, heavy irrigation to thrive. The local Indian varieties were adapted to the erratic monsoon cycle. The Monsanto seeds were not. In 2002 and 2003, the rains failed in several key cotton-growing regions, like Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. The crops withered in the fields. The bollworm, which was supposed to be eradicated, began to develop resistance, forcing farmers to buy even more expensive pesticides to save the failing harvest. The farmers were left with dead fields and insurmountable debt. The moneylenders came to collect. They shamed the farmers in front of their villages, seized their land, and threatened their families. Faced with total ruin and public humiliation, a wave of despair swept through the Indian countryside. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating through 2006 and 2007, a phenomenon known as the suicide epidemic took hold. The method of death was gruesome and symbolic. Farmers would walk out into their ruined fields, open a bottle of chemical pesticide, often sold by the same companies that sold the seeds, and drink it. They died in agony, convulsing on the soil that they had lost. The numbers were staggering. According to the Indian government's own National Crime Records Bureau, nearly 200,000 farmers committed suicide between 1997 and 2010. While the causes were complex, involving water rights, global cotton prices, and government policy, the introduction of the expensive high-risk GMO seeds was, for many activists and families, the tipping point. Monsanto's response was to deny any connection. They pointed to overall yield increases in India, which did occur in irrigated areas, and blamed the suicides on personal issues or alcoholism. They refused to acknowledge that their business model, selling high-tech, high-cost inputs to low-tech, low-income farmers, was inherently predatory. The suicide seeds narrative became a global rallying cry. Activist Vandana Shiva labeled it a genocide. Prince Charles of the UK publicly condemned the corporate industrialization of nature. But in St. Louis, the executives checked the sales figures. India was now one of the largest markets for beet cotton in the world. The genetic war had been won, even if the soldiers were dead. Back in the United States, as the decade wore on, a new biological enemy was rising from the soil to challenge Monsanto's dominance. Nature was fighting back. By 2009, farmers in Georgia and Tennessee began to notice something terrifying in their fields. They had sprayed their Roundup Ready soy with glyphosate just as they had for a decade, but some of the weeds didn't die. Specifically, a weed called Palmer amaranth, pigweed, was surviving. And it wasn't just surviving, it was mutating. It was growing thick, woody stalks that could break a combine harvester. It was growing 6 inches a day. It was choking out the crops. The constant drenching of the American landscape with a single chemical, Roundup, had created an evolutionary pressure cooker. It had bred super weeds. Monsanto's response to this ecological crisis was not to admit that the system had failed. It was to sell more chemicals. They advised farmers to spray more Roundup. When that didn't work, they began to develop crops resistant to older, harsher herbicides like dicamba and 2,4-D, a component of Agent Orange. They were trapping farmers on a chemical treadmill. The more they sprayed, the stronger the weeds got, requiring stronger chemicals, which required new seeds. It was an addiction cycle for the soil, But the most dangerous threat to the company was not the weeds, it was the chemical itself. For 40 years, Monsanto had marketed Roundup as safer than table salt. They claimed it was biodegradable and harmless to humans. In the early 2010s, independent scientists began to look closer. They found that glyphosate was not as benign as advertised. Studies in France and Argentina began to link the chemical to birth defects and, ominously, to cancer. Monsanto knew this was the kill shot. If Roundup, the cornerstone of their entire seed and chemical empire, was proven to be carcinogenic, the company would collapse. So, they activated the doubt factory. In 2012 and 2013, Monsanto launched a covert campaign to ghostwrite scientific literature. Internal emails, later released in court as the Monsanto Papers, revealed that company scientists were secretly writing articles defending the safety of glyphosate and then paying independent academics to put their names on them. They were fabricating the scientific consensus. They targeted the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, the specialized cancer agency of the World Health Organization. They knew IARC was reviewing glyphosate. They set up war rooms to discredit the agency. They planned to attack the scientists personally, but the ghostwriters couldn't stop the verdict. In March 2015, IARC dropped the bomb. They classified glyphosate as a Group 2 a probable human carcinogen. The headline flashed around the world: Roundup causes cancer. It was the beginning of the end. The invincible shield of safety was shattered. The farmers who had sprayed the chemical for decades, the landscapers who had bathed in the mist, the parents who sprayed it on their driveways, they all looked at the bottle in their garage with a new cold fear. And in a law office in California, a dying man named Dwayne Johnson picked up the phone. The genetic war was over. The legal war was about to begin. The March 2015 classification by the WHO's cancer agency, IARC, that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen was the spark that finally ignited the legal tinderbox Monsanto had spent 40 years suppressing. For decades, the company had operated under the shield of regulatory capture, using its influence at the EPA to keep Roundup labeled as safe. But the IARC ruling was international, independent, and scientifically rigorous. It gave victims the one thing they had lacked: a credible expert opinion linking their cancer to the chemical. The first person to pick up this weapon was Dwayne Lee Johnson. Johnson was not a corporate crusader, he was a school groundskeeper. A father of two from Benicia, California, he had spent years spraying hundreds of gallons of Roundup and its more potent cousin, Ranger Pro, around the playgrounds and sports fields of his school district. He wore the protective gear, but the equipment often leaked. On 2 occasions, the hose broke, soaking him from head to toe in the herbicide. In 2014, strange lesions began to appear on his skin. He went to the doctor and received a diagnosis that was a death sentence: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was terminal. The cancer spread rapidly. Soon, 80% of his body was covered in painful open sores. Desperate for answers, Johnson called the Monsanto hotline listed on the Roundup bottle. He asked if the chemical could have caused his cancer. He called repeatedly. No one ever called him back. That silence was a mistake. Johnson hired a lawyer. He became the first plaintiff to take Monsanto to trial over glyphosate. The trial, held in San Francisco in the summer of 2018, was a spectacle of David versus Goliath proportions. Monsanto deployed its army of lawyers, arguing that the EPA had deemed glyphosate safe and that the IARC ruling was junk science. They tried to bury the jury in technical data. But Johnson's lawyers had something more powerful than data. They had the Monsanto papers. During discovery, they had unearthed internal emails that revealed the company's true face. The jury saw emails where executives ghost-wrote scientific papers. They saw discussions about how to whack independent scientists. They saw a culture of arrogance and concealment. And they saw Dwayne Johnson. He took the stand, his face disfigured by lesions, and told his story. He wasn't angry. He was just dying. He wanted to know why the company hadn't warned him. On August 10, 2018, the jury returned a verdict that shook the foundations of the global chemical industry. They found that Roundup was a substantial factor in causing Johnson's cancer. They found that Monsanto had failed to warn him. And, most damningly, they found that the company had acted with malice or oppression. They awarded Dwayne Johnson $289 million. The courtroom gasped. It was one of the largest personal injury verdicts in history. The jury had sent a message. Monsanto wasn't just negligent. They were evil. The verdict triggered a legal avalanche. Within weeks, the number of plaintiffs suing Monsanto exploded from a few thousand to over 100,000. Farmers, landscapers, and home gardeners who had developed lymphoma came forward. The liability was no longer theoretical, it was existential. But for the executives at Monsanto, the timing of the verdict was a cosmic joke. Just weeks before the trial ended, they had completed the most important deal in the company's history. They had sold the entire enterprise to the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer. The $63 billion acquisition finalized in June 2018 was meant to be the crowning achievement of the Monsanto board. They had cashed out at the top of the market. They handed the keys to the Germans and walked away with their golden parachutes. For Bayer, however, the deal was a catastrophe. The German executives, arrogant in their belief that they understood the American legal system, had severely underestimated the Roundup risk. They thought they were buying a seed company. They had actually bought a cancer ward. The day the Johnson verdict was announced, Bayer's stock crashed. Shareholders in Germany were furious. They realized they had just paid $63 billion for a company that was effectively a toxic asset. The Monsanto curse had crossed the Atlantic. As 2018 drew to a close, the genetic war had ended in a strange, mutilated victory. Monsanto had conquered the world's agriculture. Its seeds grew on 6 continents. Its chemicals were in the soil of every major farming nation. But the brand itself was dead. The legal and financial fallout from the Dwayne Johnson verdict in 2018 was not merely a corporate crisis for Bayer. It was a biological reckoning for the entire agrochemical industry. The $289 million judgment signaled that the era of chemical immunity was over. Juries, made up of ordinary people, were no longer willing to accept the industry's assurance that the dose makes the poison. They had seen the internal emails, the ghost-written studies, and the human cost, and they had decided that the risk was unacceptable. In the months following the Johnson trial, the legal assault on Monsanto, now a subsidiary of Bayer, intensified. 2 more landmark trials followed in quick succession, delivering even larger verdicts. In March 2019, a federal jury awarded $80 million to Edwin Hardeman, another Roundup user diagnosed with cancer. Then in May 2019, a California jury delivered a verdict that defied comprehension. They awarded a couple, Alva and Alberta Piliad, both suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after decades of using Roundup, a staggering $2 billion in damages. These verdicts were not just financial penalties, they were moral indictments. The juries were punishing the company for decades of deception. They were sending a message that no amount of profit justified the suppression of cancer data. For Bayer, the acquisition of Monsanto had turned into the worst corporate deal in history. The company's stock value plummeted by nearly 50%, wiping out tens of billions of euros in shareholder wealth. The German executives, who had arrogantly believed they could manage the American litigation risk, found themselves trapped in a legal quagmire with no exit. They faced over 100,000 lawsuits, a hostile public, and a brand that was now legally synonymous with cancer. But the most profound consequence of the genetic war was not the destruction of a stock price. It was the destruction of trust. The Monsanto legacy had permanently poisoned the public's relationship with their food. The term GMO had become a slur, a symbol of corporate overreach and biological tampering. The company's aggressive enforcement of seed patents, its intimidation of farmers, and its disregard for environmental safety had created a global backlash against industrial agriculture. The farmers, too, were left with a bitter harvest. They were trapped on the chemical treadmill, dependent on expensive seeds and increasingly toxic herbicides to fight the superweeds that Monsanto's technology had created. The promise of easier farming had turned into a cycle of debt and dependency. The suicide seeds in India were a stark reminder that the company's business model was not designed to feed the world, but to extract value from it. As 2018 came to a close, the name Monsanto was officially retired. The company was dissolved into Bayer. The headquarters in St. Louis remained, but the sign on the door was changed. The Queenie dynasty, which had started with a sweetener in 1901, had ended with a carcinogen. The family itself had long since retreated from the business, their fortunes secured in diversified trusts and philanthropic foundations. They were insulated from the lawsuits and the shame. But the legacy they built, the harvest of death, remained in the soil, in the water, and in the bodies of the people who lived in the shadow of their factories. The story of Monsanto is a tragedy of American innovation gone wrong. It is the story of a company that conquered nature but lost its soul. It proved that science without ethics is a weapon, and that the pursuit of profit at any cost eventually demands a price that cannot be paid in dollars, but only in lives. The genetic war was over, but the casualties would continue to mount for generations. The $63 billion mistake. In the summer of 2019, the shareholders of Bayer AG gathered in Bonn, Germany, for an annual meeting that would go down in history as a corporate riot. The venerable pharmaceutical giant, the inventor of aspirin, had just completed the acquisition of Monsanto, and the result was a financial bloodbath. The Monsanto curse, which had previously been confined to the rivers of Alabama and the jungles of Vietnam, had now infected the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, since the ink had dried on the $63 billion deal. Bayer's stock price had collapsed by nearly 50%, wiping out tens of billions of euros in market value. The shareholders were furious. In a historic vote of no confidence, they formally rebuked the CEO, Werner Baumann, the architect of the merger. It was the first time in modern German corporate history that a DAX-listed company's management had been so publicly humiliated. The cause of this ruin was not a failed harvest or a bad quarter. It was the legal toxicity of the Monsanto brand. The Roundup litigation, which Bayer had arrogantly believed it could manage, had exploded into a firestorm. By late 2019, the number of plaintiffs suing the company had surged past 40,000. Every day, new cases were filed by farmers, landscapers, and home gardeners who claimed the weed killer had given them non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The American jury verdicts, $80 million here, $2 billion there, were terrifying the German investors. Bayer had not bought a seed company. They had bought a liability machine. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, Bayer initiated a brand erasure. They announced that the name Monsanto would be retired. The name that had been synonymous with American industrial might for 117 years was simply deleted from the corporate registry. The signs were taken down from the St. Louis headquarters. The business cards were shredded. The Monsanto company officially ceased to exist, absorbed into the Bayer Crop Science division. But you cannot erase a legacy with a press release. The ghost of Monsanto continued to haunt its new owner. In June 2020, Bayer announced a massive $10.9 billion settlement to resolve the vast majority of the Roundup lawsuits. It was one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in history. But unlike previous victories, where Monsanto had bought silence, this settlement did not end the war. Thousands of plaintiffs refused the deal. The future claims issue, what to do about people who used Roundup but hadn't gotten cancer yet, remained unresolved. The legal nightmare was a hydra. Cut off one head and two more appeared. While Bayer struggled to contain the Roundup disaster, a new, even more insidious scandal erupted from the company's deep past, proving that the Queenie curse was truly immortal. In 2020 and 2021, schools across the United States began to discover a toxic secret in their walls. For decades, Monsanto had been the sole manufacturer of PCBs in the U.S. These chemicals were used in the ballasts of fluorescent lights installed in thousands of schools between the 1950s and 1970s. Now, those old ballasts were leaking. In Monroe, Washington, a group of students and teachers at the Sky Valley Education Center began to get sick. They suffered from brain fog, autoimmune disorders, and strange rashes. Tests revealed that the school was contaminated with PCB vapors leaking from the lights. The victims sued, and in a series of trials that culminated in 2023, juries in Washington state delivered verdicts that stunned the corporate world. They found that Monsanto had known for decades that its PCBs were toxic and would eventually leak, but had failed to warn the schools. In one trial alone, a jury awarded $857 million to a group of students and parent volunteers. In another, the award was $185 million. The evidence presented in these trials was the same ad hoc committee memos from 1969, the sell the hell out of them documents. 50 years after Edgar Queenie's death, his handwritten notes were still condemning his company in court. The poison he had authorized was still active, still hurting children, and still draining the company's treasury. Bayer was forced to pay out over $1.5 billion in PCB verdicts in just a few years, a legacy tax that seemed to have no end. As 2023 drew to a close, the corporate funeral was in full swing. Bayer's stock was trading at lows not seen in a decade. The CEO who bought Monsanto, Werner Baumann, was forced into early retirement, his reputation destroyed. Activist investors were calling for the company to be broken up, arguing that the Monsanto infection was killing the healthy parts of the German pharmaceutical giant. The acquisition had become a case study in corporate hubris. It proved that a company's dark past is not an intangible concept. It is a financial liability that can destroy a balance sheet. Bayer had bought the assets, the seeds, the patents, the labs, but they had failed to price in the karma. They had ingested a poison pill, and now the entire organism was sick. In the final analysis, the story of Monsanto is a tragedy of scale. It is a story about what happens when a single company achieves dominion over the most fundamental building blocks of life: the water we drink, the food we eat, and the air we breathe. From the moment John Francis Queenie opened his shop in 1901 to sell saccharin, the dynasty operated on the premise that nature was a problem to be solved by chemistry, and that the consequences of that solution could be deferred, but nature keeps a perfect ledger. The Queenie curse is not supernatural, it is biological. It is the chloracin on the faces of the workers in Anniston. It is the birth defects of the children in Vietnam. It is the lymphoma in the lymph nodes of the California groundskeepers. And it is the cancer that killed Edgar Queenie himself. The family that built the empire has vanished into history, their names erased from the letterhead, their fortune dispersed into trusts. But the molecules they synthesized remain. PCBs do not break down. They cycle through the ecosystem forever. Dioxin has a half-life measured in decades, and the genetic modifications introduced into the world's crops are irreversible. Once a gene is released into the wild, it cannot be recalled. The Monsanto legacy is a permanent alteration of the planet's biology. The company proved that it is possible to privatize the profits of pollution while socializing the costs of cancer. It proved that a corporation can be too big to jail, but it cannot be too big to fail. The collapse of the brand under Bayer's ownership is a belated, messy form of justice, a confirmation that even in the immoral world of global finance, there's a limit to how much poison a balance sheet can absorb. In 2024, the cornfields of Iowa still rustle with the genetically modified stalks that Monsanto engineered. The soybeans in Brazil still carry the Roundup Ready gene. The legacy is alive, growing in the sun, but the name Monsanto is dead, buried under a mountain of lawsuits and the weight of its own history. The harvest of death has been reaped, and the world will be dealing with the yield for generations to come.